The sound of a slap echoing through a crowded food truck plaza. A pregnant woman stumbling backward. 50 strangers watching in shock as a millionaire CEO loses control in the most public way possible. What started as a simple craving for authentic tacos became the moment that shattered Victoria's carefully constructed life forever. But here's what nobody saw coming, including Victoria herself. That devastating slap would become the first step toward the freedom she didn't even know she'd lost. This isn't just another story about domestic abuse. It's about the dangerous lie we tell ourselves, that we can choose security over authenticity and somehow still be happy. It's about the moment when your past collides with your present so violently that you can't pretend anymore. You see, the man behind that food truck counter wasn't just any stranger. He was the love Victoria had abandoned 3 years earlier for a life of luxury and control. And what happened next would expose secrets so dark they'd land her husband in federal prison and force Victoria to rebuild everything from nothing. But sometimes losing everything is exactly what it takes to find yourself. The sound of Richard's palm connecting with Victoria's face echoed through the food truck plaza like a gunshot. Victoria Sterling stumbled backward, her hand instinctively flying to her swollen belly. At 8 months pregnant, her balance was already precarious, and the force of her husband's blow sent her careening toward the concrete picnic table behind her. "Richard," she gasped, more shocked than hurt, though the sting across her cheek was already blooming into heat. The food truck plaza, normally buzzing with the cheerful chaos of lunch hour, fell into stunned silence. Office workers froze mid-bite. A mother instinctively pulled her toddler closer. Even the sizzling grills seemed to quiet as dozens of eyes turned toward them. Richard Blackwood, normally the picture of composed corporate authority, stood with his chest heaving, his expensive suit wrinkled from the sudden violence of his movement. His silver hair, usually perfectly styled, had fallen across his forehead. But it was his eyes that made Victoria's blood run cold. They held a fury she'd seen before, but never in public. "Don't you dare make me look like a fool," he hissed, his voice low but carrying in the silence. Victoria's mind raced backward to how they'd gotten here. The morning had started like any other in their penthouse overlooking the city. Richard buried in his phone, fielding calls from his tech company's board. Victoria nursing her third cup of decaffeinated coffee, trying to settle the restless energy that had plagued her for weeks. "I'm craving something authentic," she'd said, scrolling through her phone. "Look, there's this new artisan food truck downtown. Mitchell's Mobile Kitchen. The reviews are incredible." Sorta. Richard had barely looked up. "Call the housekeeper. She can make whatever you want." "It's not the same. I want to get out, walk around. The doctor said movement is good for the baby." He'd sighed with the exaggerated patience he used when she asked for anything that inconvenienced him. "Fine, but I have a conference call at 2. The drive downtown had been tense. Richard complained about the traffic, the parking, the common people crowding the food truck area. Victoria had learned not to argue. After 3 years of marriage to one of the city's most successful CEOs, she'd perfected the art of peaceful coexistence. But when they'd approached Mitchell's Mobile Kitchen, everything changed. Victoria had frozen the moment she saw the man behind the counter. Tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back and sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by years of kitchen work. When he looked up and saw her, his knife had stilled on the cutting board. James Mitchell, her ex-fiancé. The man she'd left 3 years ago for the security Richard represented. "Vicky," James had said, and the nickname she hadn't heard since their breakup hit her like a physical blow. "You know this person?" Richard's voice had been deceptively calm, but Victoria knew the warning signs. We, Victoria had stammered, trapped between two worlds she'd never expected to collide. James had recovered first, his professionalism sliding into place like armor. "Welcome to Mitchell's Mobile Kitchen. What can I get you today?" But his eyes had never left Victoria's face, taking in her designer clothes, her perfectly styled hair, the massive diamond on her finger, and finally, inevitably, her rounded belly. "Congratulations," he'd said softly, and something in his voice, genuine warmth mixed with loss, had made Victoria's throat close up. Richard had stepped forward then, his hand possessive on Victoria's lower back. "My wife will have whatever's quickest. We're in a hurry." The word wife had been delivered like a weapon, and Victoria saw it hit its mark. James's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. The breakfast burrito is excellent, James had offered, his attention shifting to include Richard. Fresh eggs, locally sourced cheese, house-made salsa. How much? Richard's tone suggested the price was beneath his notice, but he asked anyway. For a pregnant lady? On the house. James's smile had been directed entirely at Victoria. Consider it a congratulations gift. And that's when Richard had snapped. Don't you dare speak to my wife like you know her. Richard's voice had risen above the ambient noise of the plaza. Who the hell do you think you are? Richard, please. Victoria had tried to intervene, but her husband had been beyond reason. How exactly do you know my wife? Richard had demanded of James, his voice carrying the authority he used in boardrooms. Answer me. James had straightened to his full height, meeting Richard's glare without flinching. I think that's Victoria's story to tell. Victoria! Richard had whirled on her, and Victoria had seen the trap closing. Tell the truth and humiliate Richard in front of all these people. Lie and risk Richard finding out later, making everything worse. He's just being friendly, Richard. You know how food people are. Food people? James had interrupted, and Victoria had seen the hurt flash across his features before he'd controlled it. The crowd had grown during their confrontation. Victoria had been dimly aware of phones being raised, of whispered conversations. Her cheeks had burned with embarrassment. I don't like the way he's looking at you, Richard had said, his hand tightening on her arm. I don't like any of this. Sir, James had said carefully, maybe you should take your wife home. She looks like she could use some rest. The implied criticism had been the final straw. Richard's control had shattered completely. Don't you tell me what my wife needs, he'd roared, and his hand had come up fast and hard across Victoria's face. Now in the ringing silence that followed, Victoria touched her cheek with trembling fingers. The baby, as if sensing the violence, had gone completely still in her womb. James vaulted over the serving counter with fluid grace, landing between Victoria and Richard. You just assaulted a pregnant woman. She's my wife, Richard shot back, but uncertainty had crept into his voice as he noticed the crowd closing in around them. I don't care if she's the Queen of England, James said, his voice deadly quiet. You put your hands on a pregnant woman in front of 50 witnesses. Victoria could hear murmurs in the crowd now. Did you see that? He hit her. Someone call the police. This is none of your business, Richard said, but his usual commanding presence had evaporated. He looked around nervously at the hostile faces surrounding them. Actually, said a woman's voice from the crowd, this is exactly my business. A Hispanic woman in her mid-40s pushed through the circle of onlookers, her hand resting casually on her hip in a way that made her jacket fall open, revealing a police badge. I'm Detective Maria Rodriguez, and I just witnessed an assault. She looked directly at Richard. Sir, I need you to step away from your wife. Richard's face had gone pale. This is a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, said an older man holding up his phone. Got the whole thing recorded. Victoria felt the world tilting around her. This was a nightmare. Richard's reputation, their life together, everything was crumbling in real time. And all because she'd wanted authentic tacos. And then, as if the universe had decided she hadn't suffered enough humiliation for one day, Victoria felt a sudden gush of warm fluid down her legs. Oh no, she whispered, looking down at the puddle forming at her feet. Oh no, oh no, oh no. James was beside her instantly, his hand supporting her elbow. Hey, it's okay. Just breathe. This isn't supposed to happen yet, Victoria gasped, panic rising in her throat. It's too early. The baby isn't due for another month. Detective Rodriguez was already on her radio, calling for an ambulance. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of horror as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. Victoria, he started, reaching toward her, but James intercepted his movement. I think you've done enough, James said firmly. A contraction hit Victoria then, sharp and unmistakable, and she doubled over with a cry of pain and fear. This was supposed to be the happiest time of her life, and instead she was going into premature labor in a food truck plaza, her marriage exploding around her like shrapnel. Help is coming, James murmured, his arms steady around her shoulders. You're going to be okay. The baby's going to be okay. Victoria looked up at him through tears she didn't remember starting to cry. Jamie, she whispered, using his old nickname without thinking. His eyes softened with memory and pain. I'm here, Vicky. I'm right here. Behind them, she could hear Detective Rodriguez reading Richard his rights. The ambulance arrived with a symphony of sirens that drew even more onlookers to the plaza. Victoria found herself the unwilling center of a three-ring circus as paramedics, police officers, and curious bystanders all tried to make sense of what had happened. Ma'am, how far apart are your contractions? Asked the lead EMT, a young woman with kind eyes and efficient hands. I don't know, Victoria gasped as another wave of pain rolled through her. Maybe 5 minutes? Okay, we're going to get you to the hospital right away. The EMT looked around at the chaos surrounding them. Who's the husband? That would be me, Richard said, trying to push past the police officer who was blocking his path. Officer, this is ridiculous. My wife needs medical attention, not a crime scene. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward, her notepad already out. Mr. Blackwood, your wife is receiving excellent medical care. Right now, I need statements from everyone who witnessed what happened here. Victoria closed her eyes, trying to focus on breathing through another contraction. This was a disaster beyond her worst nightmares. Richard arrested, her water broken in public, her past colliding with her present in the most spectacular way possible. Vicky, look at me. James's voice was calm and steady. He'd moved to crouch beside the gurney where the paramedics had positioned her. Remember what we used to practice? Deep breaths, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Despite everything, Victoria found herself responding to his familiar voice. They'd talked about children once, in those golden months when they'd thought they had forever ahead of them. James had researched everything about pregnancy and childbirth with the same intensity he brought to perfecting a new dish. You remember, she said wonderingly. I remember everything, he replied quietly. Excuse me, Richard's voice cut through their moment like a knife. I don't know who you think you are, but that's my wife and my baby. James stood slowly, and Victoria saw something flash in his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Age, maybe, or authority earned through hard experience. Your wife, James said carefully, is the woman you just slapped in front of 50 people. Your baby is in distress because of your actions. So maybe focus on that instead of territorial posturing. Territorial? Richard laughed harshly. You're a food truck operator. I own a company worth $200 million. There's no territory to dispute here. Mr. Blackwood, Detective Rodriguez interrupted, I need you to stop talking. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. The weight of those words seemed to finally penetrate Richard's anger. He looked around at the crowd, at the phones recording everything, at his wife being loaded into an ambulance. For the first time since Victoria had known him, Richard Blackwood looked genuinely afraid. This is insane, he muttered. Victoria, tell them it was an accident. Tell them you slipped. Victoria stared at her husband, the man who had given her security and status and a beautiful life, the man who had also just humiliated her in front of strangers and set off premature labor with his violence. Mrs. Blackwood, Detective Rodriguez said gently, can you tell me what happened here? Victoria looked between Richard's pleading face and James's worried expression. The EMTs were waiting to transport her, but everyone seemed frozen, waiting for her words. She started, then another contraction hit, harder this time. She gripped the sides of the gurney and tried to breathe through it. We need to go, the lead EMT announced. This baby isn't waiting for statements. I'll ride with her, Richard said, moving toward the ambulance. No, James said firmly, stepping into his path. You're not going anywhere near her right now. You have no right. Actually, Detective Rodriguez said, consulting her notes, there's something interesting here. Mr. Mitchell, you told me earlier that you know Mrs. Blackwood from before her marriage. Care to elaborate? James glanced at Victoria, clearly asking permission. She found herself nodding almost imperceptibly. Victoria Sterling was my fiancée 3 years ago, James said, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. We were together for 2 years. We were planning to open a restaurant together. The admission sent ripples through the gathered crowd. Richard's face went white, then red, then white again. That's impossible, he said. Victoria never mentioned. There's a lot Victoria never mentioned, apparently, Detective Rodriguez said dryly. Mr. Mitchell, in your opinion, was today's incident out of character for Mr. Blackwood? James hesitated and Victoria saw him weighing his words carefully. I wouldn't know about his character, but I can tell you that the Victoria I knew 3 years ago would never have let anyone speak to her the way he did today. The Victoria I knew would have left the first time a man raised his hand to her. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Victoria saw understanding dawn on Detective Rodriguez's face. Mrs. Blackwood, the detective said gently, has your husband ever struck you before? The question she'd been dreading. Victoria looked at Richard, saw the desperation in his eyes, the silent pleading. He'd given her everything when she had nothing. Security, status, protection from the financial fears that had driven her father to an early grave. But he'd also isolated her from friends, controlled her choices, and now he'd hurt her in the most public way possible. I need to get to the hospital, Victoria said finally, avoiding the question entirely. Detective Rodriguez nodded. We'll continue this conversation later. Mr. Mitchell, would you be available to give a formal statement? Of course, James replied. And detective, I want to press charges for assault. What he did to Victoria, that can't be okay just because they're married. Richard's lawyer would arrive soon, Victoria knew. Expensive legal counsel would spin this as a misunderstanding, a private marital dispute blown out of proportion. Richard had resources and connections that could make this disappear. But as the ambulance doors closed and they pulled away from the plaza, Victoria found herself thinking about the look in James's eyes when he'd said he remembered everything. The way he'd stepped between her and Richard without hesitation. The gentleness in his voice when he'd helped her breathe through the contractions. For 3 years, she'd told herself she'd made the right choice. Security over passion, stability over uncertainty. A man who could provide over a man who could only promise. Now, feeling another contraction building in her abdomen, she wondered if she'd been wrong about everything. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Blackwood, Richard's mother. Flying in from Martha's Vineyard. Do not speak to anyone until I arrive. This family will not be destroyed by your mistakes. Victoria stared at the message, then deleted it without responding. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't care what Eleanor thought was best for the family reputation. She had bigger problems now. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and Victoria was beginning to realize she wasn't ready for anything that was about to happen to her life. As the contractions gradually subsided at the hospital, Victoria found herself alone for the first time in hours. Richard was somewhere in the building, probably making calls to his lawyers. The nurses had finally stopped fussing over her monitors. Dr. Emily Parker had pronounced both mother and baby stable, though she'd ordered complete bed rest and observation. Victoria stared at the ceiling tiles and let herself remember what she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. James Mitchell had entered her life like a perfect storm on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She'd been working on a freelance article about farm-to-table restaurants when she'd walked into his tiny kitchen at Seasons, a restaurant everyone was calling the next big thing. She'd expected attitude, maybe some celebrity chef arrogance. Instead, she'd found a man in worn jeans and a stained apron, patiently teaching his sous chef how to properly brunoise carrots. When he'd looked up and seen her with her notepad and recorder, he'd smiled like she was an old friend instead of another food critic. You must be Victoria Sterling, he'd said, wiping his hands on his apron. I read your piece on sustainable seafood last month. Made me rethink our entire fish program. That was James, always learning, always growing, never too proud to admit when someone else had a good idea. Over the course of their interview, which had stretched from afternoon into evening, Victoria had found herself genuinely fascinated, not just by his food, but by his philosophy. Cooking isn't about showing off, he'd told her, as he'd plated a tasting menu that had made her reconsider everything she thought she knew about American cuisine. It's about connection. Every dish should tell a story that connects the chef to the diner, the farmer to the table, the past to the present. Victoria had gone home that night and written what would become one of her most read articles. But more than that, she'd gone home thinking about James Mitchell's hands as he'd worked, the way he'd listened to his staff, the passion in his voice when he talked about supporting local farmers. Their courtship had been unconventional. He'd cooked for her in his apartment after 18-hour days at the restaurant. She'd helped him test recipes, offering feedback from a diner's perspective rather than a chef's. They'd fallen in love over late-night conversations about everything from food philosophy to their childhood dreams. James had grown up poor, the son of a single mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. His love of cooking had started with necessity, learning to make filling, nutritious meals from whatever ingredients they could afford. Scholarships had gotten him through culinary school, and raw talent had done the rest. Victoria's background had been solidly middle class until her father's diagnosis with early onset Alzheimer's. She'd watched her parents' comfortable retirement savings evaporate as they'd fought for every extra month of clarity, every treatment that might slow the disease's progression. Her father had died when Victoria was 26, leaving her mother with a mountain of medical debt and Victoria with a terror of financial insecurity that ran soul deep. She'd been honest with James about her fears. He'd understood, even when she'd had panic attacks about money, even when she'd insisted on keeping separate accounts and emergency funds. "We'll build something together," he'd promised when he'd proposed on the roof of his restaurant, the city sparkling below them. "Something that can't be taken away." They'd planned everything. A small wedding, a restaurant of their own, children eventually. James had been working 18-hour days to save money for their joint venture. Victoria had been building her freelance writing business, dreaming of covering their restaurant's opening for a national magazine. Then Marcus Webb, their investor, had pulled out 3 days before the lease signing. A family crisis, he'd said. His own restaurant chain was struggling. He couldn't commit the funds they needed. Victoria remembered the night James had come home with the news. They'd sat in his tiny kitchen, surrounded by notebooks full of menu ideas and business plans that were suddenly worthless paper. "We'll find another investor," he'd said, but Victoria had heard the uncertainty in his voice. "With what? We've been turned down by every bank in the city. There are other ways. We could start smaller, work our way up. James, we can't live on dreams." The words had come out harsher than she'd intended, sharpened by old fears. "I can't do this again. I can't watch everything fall apart because we didn't have enough money to make it work." They'd fought that night for the first time in their relationship. Really fought, with raised voices and accusations, and all the ugly truth that comes out when people are scared and desperate. 2 days later, Richard Blackwood had called. Victoria had interviewed him 6 months earlier for a piece about successful entrepreneurs under 40. He'd been charming, intelligent, recently divorced, and worth more money than Victoria had ever imagined one person could possess. He'd asked her to dinner, and she'd politely declined, mentioning her engagement. But his call had come at exactly the wrong moment, when her world with James was crumbling and her old fears were resurging with vengeance. "I know you're engaged," Richard had said, "but I also know that restaurants fail 90% of the time. I read about your investor backing out. That's got to be devastating." Victoria had been shocked that he'd known, but Richard had explained that he made it his business to know things about people who interested him. His company specialized in acquiring struggling businesses and turning them profitable. He understood risk better than anyone. "I'm not calling to interfere with your personal life," he'd said. "I'm calling because I think you're incredibly talented, and talent shouldn't be wasted on pipe dreams. I'm starting a new foundation focused on food security and sustainable agriculture. I need someone to run communications. The salary is twice what you're making freelance, plus benefits, plus equity if you're interested in the long term." The offer had been a lifeline exactly when Victoria needed one most. Financial security, meaningful work, a chance to make a real impact instead of just writing about other people's successes. She'd told herself she was just exploring her options, just having lunch to hear the details, just being practical. But Richard Blackwood had not become wealthy by failing to recognize opportunity. Over the course of 3 carefully orchestrated encounters, lunch, dinner, a charity gala where he'd introduced her to city leaders as "my brilliant new communications director," he'd painted a picture of a life Victoria had never imagined possible. Private jets to food conferences, a penthouse apartment with a view of the entire city, connections with James Beard Award winners and food policy experts who could amplify her writing to national prominence, security so complete that money would never be a source of anxiety again. "I'm not asking you to choose me over him," Richard had said during their 3rd dinner together at a restaurant that cost more per meal than Victoria typically spent in a week. I'm asking you to choose yourself. Choose your potential. Choose the impact you could have with the right resources behind you. Victoria had gone home that night to find James working on their restaurant's conceptual menu, surrounded by ingredients he'd bought with the last of their savings, cooking for an audience of one in preparation for a dream that might never happen. The contrast had been devastating. James's passion was beautiful, but it was also naive. Richard's pragmatism was seductive in a way that made Victoria feel sophisticated and mature, like she was finally thinking like an adult instead of a dreaming child. The breakup had been brutal. James had fought for them, had begged her to give him time to find another solution. He'd offered to give up the restaurant entirely, to take a job cooking for someone else if that's what it took to keep them together. But Victoria had already made her choice, and she'd known that any hesitation would weaken her resolve. She'd been ruthless in ending it, saying things designed to hurt him enough that he wouldn't keep trying. "I want more than you can give me," she'd said, standing in his apartment, surrounded by all the evidence of their shared life. "I want security. I want nice things. I want to not worry about money every single day." "So you're choosing him," James had said quietly. "I'm choosing myself," Victoria had replied, echoing Richard's words. James had nodded slowly, and she'd seen something die in his eyes. "If that's what you really want, then I hope you're happy." "I will be," she'd said with false confidence. "If you change your mind," he'd said as she'd packed the last of her things, "I'll be here." But Victoria had never looked back. She'd thrown herself into her new life with Richard, convincing herself that the hollow feeling in her chest was just adjustment, that the way Richard spoke to service staff was just different, not wrong, that his need to control every aspect of their life together was protectiveness, not possessiveness. She'd married him in a lavish ceremony covered by 3 society magazines. She'd learned to navigate charity galas and board meetings and the complicated social dynamics of being married to one of the city's most powerful men. She'd gotten pregnant after a year of trying and convinced herself that the distant way Richard discussed their future child was just his practical nature. She'd built a beautiful life on a foundation of lies she'd told herself. And she'd been successful right up until the moment James Mitchell had looked up from his food truck and said her name. Now lying in a hospital bed with her marriage in ruins and her baby threatening to arrive a month early, Victoria finally admitted the truth she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She'd been wrong about everything. Eleanor Blackwood arrived at the hospital like an avenging angel in Chanel, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the red-eye flight from Martha's Vineyard. Victoria heard her before she saw her, Eleanor's voice carrying down the corridor with the authority of someone accustomed to having her words treated as commands. "Where is my daughter-in-law? I was told there was some sort of incident." Victoria closed her eyes and braced herself. Eleanor had never liked her, had always viewed Victoria as an opportunistic gold digger who trapped her precious son. The fact that Eleanor herself had married into the Blackwood fortune 40 years earlier was apparently irrelevant to her judgment of Victoria's motives. "Mrs. Sterling." Eleanor swept into the room, followed by a man Victoria didn't recognize. Expensive suit, briefcase, the unmistakable air of high-powered legal counsel. "William Hayes, family attorney. We need to discuss what happened today." "Hello, Eleanor," Victoria said wearily. "Where's Richard?" "Being processed," Eleanor said crisply. "A temporary inconvenience that will resolve shortly. More importantly, we need to control the narrative before this gets completely out of hand." She pulled out her phone and showed Victoria a video that made her stomach clench. There she was, 8 months pregnant, being slapped by her husband in full view of dozens of onlookers. The footage was grainy but clear enough to be damning. "This has been viewed 50,000 times in the past 6 hours, Eleanor continued. "Social media is calling for Richard's head. The company's stock is down 12%. We have a crisis." "Eleanor," Victoria said slowly, "your son assaulted me. I'm in the hospital because the stress sent me into premature labor. Maybe the crisis is that he's become abusive." Eleanor's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Abusive? Victoria, you're being dramatic. Richard was understandably upset to discover you'd been keeping secrets about your past. Men like my son don't handle surprises well." "Men like your son," Victoria repeated. "You mean millionaires who think they can do whatever they want?" "I mean successful men who've worked hard to build something meaningful," Eleanor snapped. "Men who deserve loyalty from their wives, not humiliation in front of common food vendors. The casual dismissal of James as a common food vendor sparked something in Victoria that surprised her with its intensity. That common food vendor was good enough for me before I needed rescuing from my debts, she said. Eleanor's expression shifted to something calculating. Ah, yes, your father's medical bills. I remember. $60,000 in debt when Richard found you, wasn't it? Living in that tiny apartment above the bakery, wearing clothes from Target. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to remind Victoria exactly what she owed the Blackwood family. But instead of shame, Victoria felt a strange kind of clarity. Yes, she said simply. I was poor. I chose money over love. We all know that. William Hayes cleared his throat. Mrs. Blackwood, we need to focus on the immediate situation. The police have video evidence of the incident, multiple witness statements, and unfortunately, your husband made some inflammatory remarks before his arrest. What kind of remarks? Victoria asked. Hayes consulted his notes. He told Detective Rodriguez, and I quote, "My wife knows better than to embarrass me like this. She'll come to her senses once she remembers who pays for her lifestyle." Victoria stared at him. He said that. Among other things. Mrs. Blackwood, I need to ask you directly. Are you willing to testify that today's incident was an isolated occurrence? That your husband has never been physical with you before? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria thought about the times Richard had grabbed her arm too hard during arguments. The way he'd thrown his phone against the wall last month when she'd questioned a charge on their credit card statement. The night he'd locked her out of their bedroom after she'd dared to disagree with him at a dinner party. Never quite crossing the line into undeniable abuse, but always pushing boundaries, testing how much control he could exert. Victoria, Eleanor said carefully, you need to think very carefully about your answer. Richard has been generous with you. Your mother's mortgage is paid off because of his generosity. Your health insurance, your lifestyle, your security, all of that depends on protecting this family. Are you threatening me? Victoria asked. I'm reminding you of reality, Eleanor replied smoothly. You signed a prenuptial agreement that leaves you with very little if this marriage ends. With a baby coming, you might want to consider what's in your child's best interest. Victoria felt the baby kick then, as if responding to the tension in the room. She placed her hand on her belly and thought about the conversation she'd had with James earlier. His gentle voice helping her breathe through contractions, the way he'd stepped between her and Richard without hesitation. I need time to think, Victoria said finally. Time is a luxury we don't have, Hayes replied. The district attorney's office is deciding whether to file charges. If you give a statement that this was an isolated incident, a moment of stress that got out of hand, we can probably get this reduced to a misdemeanor with anger management classes. And if I don't? Hayes and Eleanor exchanged glances. If you testify that there's a pattern of abuse, Richard could face felony domestic violence charges. The company would have to remove him as CEO to protect shareholders. Your lifestyle, your security, everything you've built with this family, it would all disappear. Victoria closed her eyes. 3 years ago, this decision would have been easy. Security over justice. Stability over truth. The practical choice over the moral one. But something had changed in the food truck plaza today. Maybe it was seeing James again, remembering who she used to be before fear made all her choices for her. Maybe it was the realization that her beautiful life had been built on increasingly fragile lies. Or maybe it was just that getting slapped while 8 months pregnant had finally shown her what rock bottom looked like. I want to see Richard, she said. Eleanor smiled, clearly interpreting this as victory. Of course. Once you talk to him, I'm sure you'll... I want to see him, Victoria continued, so I can tell him our marriage is over. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's face went through several colors before settling on a shade of pale that suggested genuine shock. Victoria, she said carefully, you're not thinking clearly. The stress, the pregnancy hormones. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 3 years, Victoria replied. Your son didn't just slap me today, Eleanor. He humiliated me in front of strangers, sent me into premature labor, and then told the police that I needed to remember who pays for my lifestyle. Does that sound like a man who loves me or a man who thinks he owns me? Hayes was scribbling notes frantically. Mrs. Blackwood, I strongly advise against making any hasty decisions. The only hasty decision I made was marrying him in the first place, Victoria said. I chose security over love, and I've been paying for it ever since. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Thompson. Saw the video online. On my way to the hospital. Don't make any decisions until I get there. Sarah, her best friend from college, the only person who'd been brave enough to tell Victoria she was making a mistake when she left James. The friend Victoria had gradually lost touch with because Richard didn't like her negative influence. Victoria smiled for the first time since the morning. Eleanor, I think you should leave. I will not. You will, Victoria said firmly, because I'm about to call hospital security and have you removed. Your son is going to face the consequences of his actions, and I'm going to figure out how to build a life that isn't dependent on his generosity. Eleanor stood slowly, her composure cracking for the first time Victoria had ever seen. You're making a terrible mistake. You have no idea how to survive without us. Maybe not, Victoria admitted, but I'm about to learn. After they left, Victoria stared at the ceiling and tried to process what she'd just done. In the span of 12 hours, she'd lost her marriage, her security, and possibly her mind. But for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel afraid. She felt free. James Mitchell stood in the wreckage of his professional life and tried not to think about Victoria's face when Richard had hit her. 67 violations, Marcus Webb said, reading from the health inspector's report. Everything from improper food storage temperatures to unlicensed food handling. They want to shut us down permanently. James looked around his food truck, the same truck that had passed health inspections flawlessly for 2 years running. Yesterday it had been pristine. Today, after a visit from inspectors who'd arrived within an hour of Eleanor Blackwood's departure from the hospital, it was apparently a public health menace. The food storage temperatures are controlled by a digital system that logs every reading, James said wearily. We have documentation proving compliance. They're saying the documentation is fabricated, Marcus replied. They're also questioning our permits, our licensing, our insurance. James, they're trying to destroy us. Through the truck's window, James could see the other vendors watching nervously. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, and everyone knew that crossing the Blackwood family meant consequences. Already, 2 other trucks had announced they were moving to different locations, not wanting to be associated with the drama. James's phone had been ringing all afternoon, reporters wanting statements, food bloggers looking for gossip, and 3 separate calls from lawyers offering to represent him for a percentage of any settlement. But the only call that mattered was the one he'd been avoiding. His phone buzzed again with a text from Detective Rodriguez. Need formal statement about your relationship with Victoria Blackwood? Available this evening? James stared at the message. Giving that statement would mean publicly detailing his relationship with Victoria, destroying whatever privacy they'd had left. It would mean admitting to the world that he'd lost the woman he'd loved to a man with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. But it might also mean protecting her from a man who thought marriage gave him the right to violence. You know, Marcus said carefully, we could just walk away from this. Cut our losses. I've got job offers from 3 restaurants in Seattle. You could probably get hired anywhere you wanted. James considered it. He'd built a good life after Victoria left, but it was a careful life, constructed around the hole she'd left behind. He'd thrown himself into work, earned recognition, built a business that let him feed people without the pretension of fine dining. But he'd also spent 3 years convincing himself he was over her, only to discover in one devastating moment that some wounds never really heal. I can't walk away, James said finally. Because of the business? Because of her. James set down the inspector's report and looked at his best friend. Marcus, I need to tell you something I probably should have told you a long time ago. Marcus waited, and James found himself thinking about the last real conversation he'd had with Victoria, the night before she'd ended their engagement. They'd been in his apartment, sharing a bottle of wine, and trying to pretend they weren't both terrified about their uncertain future. Victoria had been quiet all evening, and James had known she was wrestling with something. What if we're making a mistake? She'd asked suddenly. About the restaurant? About all of it. About thinking love is enough to build a life on. James had set down his wine glass and really looked at her. Victoria's face had been shadowed with something that went deeper than disappointment about their investor backing out. There'd been fear there, the kind of bone-deep anxiety he'd learned to recognize from her stories about her father's illness. Love isn't enough by itself, he'd said carefully, but it's the foundation. Everything else we can build. Shot sword. With what? Victoria's voice had been raw with exhaustion. James, we have no money, no investors, no backup plan. What if we fail? What if we lose everything and end up like my parents, drowning in debt we can't escape? James had reached for her hands, but she'd pulled away. Your parents didn't fail, he'd said. They fought for every day they could have together. That's not failure. That's love. Love doesn't pay medical bills, Victoria had replied bitterly. Love doesn't keep you from losing your house or having to choose between food and medication. I watched my father die knowing he was bankrupting my mother, and I won't live like that. James had tried to comfort her, had promised they'd find another way. But he'd seen something change in Victoria's face that night, a door closing that he hadn't known how to reopen. Now, 3 years later, Marcus was looking at him with the patience of someone who'd watched his best friend pretend to be over a woman who'd clearly broken his heart. I never stopped loving her, James said simply. When she left me for Richard Blackwood, I told myself it was about money, about security, about her being shallow and materialistic. It was easier than admitting the truth, which was that she was terrified. Her father's medical bills had destroyed her family financially. She'd watched her mother work 3 jobs just to keep up with interest payments on debt they'd never be able to repay. Victoria didn't leave me for Richard's money. She left because she couldn't handle the risk of going through that again. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. So what changed today? I saw what she'd gotten in exchange for security, James said. A man who thinks he owns her, a man who slapped her in public because she dared to acknowledge that she knew me. Marcus, she looked like a ghost of herself, like she'd been slowly disappearing for 3 years. James thought about the Victoria he'd known, fierce, independent, unafraid to challenge him when she thought he was wrong. The woman who'd stood up to food critics twice her age and built a freelance career through pure determination. The woman who'd held his hand through every small triumph and setback of those 2 years they'd been together. Today she'd flinched when Richard raised his voice. She'd apologized for things that weren't her fault. She'd become small and careful and diminished. I failed her, James said. 3 years ago, when she was drowning in fear about money, I offered her dreams instead of solutions. I was so focused on our romantic future that I didn't address her practical concerns. I let her believe she had to choose between love and security instead of helping her find a way to have both. You were 29 years old and trying to start a business, Marcus pointed out. You're not responsible for solving everyone's problems. No, but I'm responsible for the people I love, and I loved her more than I'd ever loved anyone. But I was too proud and too naive to really hear what she needed. James's phone rang then, a number he didn't recognize. Mitchell's Mobile Kitchen. James? It's Sarah Thompson, Victoria's friend from college. James remembered Sarah, smart, funny, fiercely protective of Victoria. She'd been the one person who'd seemed genuinely sad when Victoria had announced her engagement to Richard. Sarah, how is she? Scared, confused, about to make the biggest decision of her life with no support system because she's been isolated from everyone who actually cares about her. James closed his eyes. What do you need from me? Nothing, Sarah said, but there's something you need to know. Victoria's been unhappy for a long time. This marriage, it's been slowly killing her spirit. Today was just the first time Richard's controlling behavior crossed into undeniable abuse. Sarah, if there's anything I can do, there is. When the lawyers and the investigators start asking questions about your relationship with Victoria, tell the truth. All of it. Don't protect Richard's reputation or Victoria's privacy. Tell them exactly what kind of man she was before she married him and what kind of man she left him for. James understood. Sarah was asking him to do what he should have done 3 years ago. Fight for Victoria instead of letting her go quietly. The health department is trying to shut down my business, he said. Eleanor Blackwood is apparently very thorough in her revenge. Sarah laughed bitterly. Eleanor Blackwood is about to discover that bullying restaurant inspectors is nothing compared to what happens when you mess with someone who has nothing left to lose. Victoria's finally ready to fight back, James. The question is whether you're ready to fight with her. After Sarah hung up, James looked at Marcus, who'd been listening to the conversation with growing understanding. "We're not walking away, are we?" Marcus said. "No," James replied. "We're not. Even if it costs us everything." James thought about Victoria's face when Richard had slapped her. The shock, the humiliation, the fear. Then he thought about the woman he'd fallen in love with, the one who'd written fearless critiques of celebrated chefs, who'd taught him that good food was about more than technique, who'd made him believe that building something together was worth any risk. That woman was still in there somewhere, buried under 3 years of fear and compromise. And James Mitchell had spent 3 years learning that some things were worth losing everything for. "Some fights are worth having," he said. Victoria woke to the sound of hushed voices in her hospital room. Dr. Parker was conferring with a nurse, both of them studying her chart with expressions that made Victoria's stomach clench. "Is the baby okay?" she asked immediately. Dr. Parker turned with a reassuring smile. "Baby's fine. Strong heartbeat, good movement. You, on the other hand, need to discuss some lifestyle changes." Victoria struggled to sit up, her body protesting after 12 hours of bed rest. "What kind of changes?" "Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated. Your stress hormones are through the roof. Victoria, I've been your doctor for 6 months, and I've watched you become increasingly anxious with each visit. Today's incident appears to have been the breaking point." The doctor pulled up a chair beside the bed. "I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I need honest answers. Has your husband ever been physical with you before today?" Victoria looked toward the window, where morning light was beginning to filter through the blinds. Somewhere in this same building, Richard was probably meeting with more lawyers, crafting his defense, trying to minimize what had happened. "Not exactly," Victoria said carefully. "What does not exactly mean?" Victoria thought about how to explain the gradual erosion of boundaries, the way Richard's control had increased so slowly she'd barely noticed until she was completely surrounded by it. "He's never hit me before," she said finally, "but he's physical when he's angry. He'll grab my arm hard enough to leave marks. He threw his coffee mug at the wall next to my head last month. He locked me out of our bedroom once after I disagreed with him at a dinner party." Dr. Parker was writing notes, her expression growing more concerned. "Victoria, these are all forms of domestic abuse. The fact that he escalated to hitting you in public suggests the private behavior has been getting worse." "I know," Victoria said quietly. "I've known for months, maybe longer." "Then why?" Dr. Parker stopped herself. "I'm sorry. That's not my place to ask." "Because I was scared," Victoria said. "Because when you grow up watching your family lose everything to medical debt, financial security becomes more important than emotional security. Because I convinced myself that being controlled was better than being poor." The door opened and Sarah Thompson appeared with coffee and the kind of determined expression that had gotten her through medical school while working 3 jobs. "Good," Sarah said, seeing Dr. Parker. "You're talking sense into her. Victoria, I brought you clothes and your laptop. You're not going back to that penthouse." "Sarah, no arguments. You're staying with me until you figure out what comes next." "Dr. Parker, please tell her that stress is bad for the baby, so she'll stop trying to fix everyone else's problems." Dr. Parker smiled. "Actually, I was about to discuss exactly that. Victoria, you need complete bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy. No stress, no drama, no major life decisions. Focus on keeping this baby healthy." "I can't exactly avoid stress when my husband is being charged with assault and my marriage is ending," Victoria pointed out. "Which is why," Sarah said, settling into the visitor's chair, "we're going to handle this one step at a time. First step, formal separation. Second step, divorce proceedings. Third step, figuring out what you want your life to look like." Victoria's phone buzzed with yet another call from Eleanor. She declined it automatically, but the action reminded her of something that had been nagging at her. "Sarah, yesterday at the food truck plaza, Richard seemed to know I was hiding something about James before I even said anything. Like he'd been suspicious." Sarah's expression darkened. "What kind of suspicious?" "He kept asking how I knew James, like he already suspected there was more to the story than I was telling him." "Victoria," Sarah said slowly, "has Richard ever gone through your phone, your computer, your personal things?" The question hit Victoria like ice water. She thought about all the times she'd found her laptop move slightly from where she'd left it. The way Richard always seemed to know when she'd received calls or texts. The fact that he'd known about James's investor backing out. Information she was certain she'd never shared with him. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's been spying on me." Dr. Parker looked between them. "Spying how?" "I don't know," Victoria said, her mind racing. "But he knows things he shouldn't know. About my past, about my conversations. I thought he was just good at reading people, but..." She stopped as another realization hit her. The prenatal vitamins? What about them? "They've been making me sleepy. Unusually sleepy." Richard said it was normal, that pregnancy fatigue was common in the third trimester. "But Sarah, I've been so tired I can barely function some days." Sarah was on her feet immediately. "Where are these vitamins?" "At home. Richard brings them to me with breakfast every morning. He's very particular about me taking them on schedule." Dr. Parker was looking alarmed now. "Sarah, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to get those vitamins tested," Sarah said grimly. "Victoria, describe your symptoms." "Everything." Victoria thought back over the past few months. Excessive fatigue, difficulty concentrating, short-term memory problems. "I thought it was just pregnancy brain, but those are also symptoms of benzodiazepine use," Dr. Parker finished. "Low-dose, regular administration could cause exactly what you're describing." The room went silent as the implications sank in. Victoria felt sick, and not from morning nausea. "He's been drugging me," she said numbly. "My own husband has been drugging me to keep me compliant." Sarah was pacing now, her nurse training taking over. "It would explain why you've seemed so unlike yourself lately. Why you've been so passive, so willing to go along with whatever he wanted." Victoria thought about all the decisions she'd made in recent months that had seemed unlike her. Agreeing to stop working entirely when Richard suggested it. Cutting contact with old friends because it was easier. Accepting his increasingly controlling behavior as normal. "I have to get those vitamins," she said, trying to get out of bed. "No," Dr. Parker said firmly. "You're not going anywhere." "Sarah, can you..." "Already on it," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling Detective Rodriguez. This changes everything." As Sarah spoke to the detective, Victoria stared at her hands. 3 years of marriage, and she was just now discovering that her husband had been systematically undermining her mental clarity. The man who'd promised to protect her had been slowly poisoning her. "Victoria," Dr. Parker said gently, "I need to run some blood tests. If there are traces of unprescribed medications in your system, it could affect the baby's development." "Is she going to be okay?" Victoria asked, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "Babies are remarkably resilient," Dr. Parker assured her, "but we need to know what we're dealing with." Sarah finished her call and returned to Victoria's bedside. "Detective Rodriguez is getting a warrant to search your apartment. They'll test the vitamins, check for surveillance equipment, go through Richard's computer records." "Victoria, if what we suspect is true, this goes way beyond domestic violence. This is systematic psychological abuse with possible drugging. Richard is looking at serious criminal charges." Victoria should have felt vindicated or relieved or angry. Instead, she felt hollow. The man she'd married, the one she'd thought would protect her from all the fears that had driven her away from James, had been the source of a different kind of terror entirely. "How did I not see it?" she asked. "Because that's how psychological abuse works," Sarah replied. "It happens so gradually that you don't notice until you're completely isolated and dependent. And if he was drugging you on top of it..." Victoria's phone rang, James's number. She stared at it for a moment before answering. "Victoria? I heard about the warrant. Are you okay?" His voice was gentle, concerned, with none of the judgmental tone she deserved. Victoria found herself crying for the first time since the day before. "I'm such an idiot, Jamie. I chose money over love, and the money came with a man who's been slowly destroying me for 3 years. I gave up everything real for something completely fake." "Hey," James said softly. "You survived. You got out. That's what matters now." "I don't know how to start over," Victoria admitted. "I don't even know who I am anymore without someone telling me what to think." "You're the woman who wrote the most honest food criticism I've ever read," James said. You're the person who convinced me that cooking should be about connection, not ego. You're strong and smart and brave, even when you don't feel like it. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to remember that version of herself. The health department shut down your truck because of me, she said. The health department shut down my truck because Eleanor Blackwood thinks she can intimidate everyone in this city, James corrected. But she's about to learn that some people can't be bought or bullied. After they hung up, Victoria lay in the hospital bed and tried to imagine what came next. No husband, no home, no clear source of income, and a baby coming in a few weeks. 3 years ago, this scenario would have terrified her into staying with Richard no matter what he'd done. Now it just felt like the first day of getting her life back. Victoria's water broke at exactly 9:37 p.m. during Richard's biggest investor presentation of the year. She knew the timing precisely because she was watching the live stream from her laptop in Sarah's guest room, fascinated by her husband's ability to smile charmingly for the cameras while knowing his wife was about to testify against him in court. "Sarah," Victoria called, trying to stay calm as she felt the familiar tightening in her abdomen that signaled the onset of real labor. Sarah appeared in the doorway, took one look at Victoria's face, and immediately shifted into crisis mode. "How far apart are the contractions?" "This is the first one since my water broke," Victoria gasped. "But it's stronger than anything I felt yesterday." As if summoned by her words, another contraction gripped her, stronger and more insistent than the practice rounds her body had been doing for weeks. Victoria breathed through it, using the techniques Dr. Parker had taught her, and tried not to think about the fact that her baby was choosing to arrive during the most complicated week of her life. "Hospital," Sarah said definitively, grabbing the overnight bag they'd packed that afternoon. "Now." But as they were heading for the door, Victoria's phone rang. Detective Rodriguez. "Mrs. Blackwood, we've executed the search warrant on your apartment. You need to know what we found." Another contraction hit, and Victoria doubled over, breathing hard. "Detective, I'm in labor. Can this wait?" "Unfortunately, no. We found surveillance equipment throughout your apartment. Cameras, microphones, keystroke loggers on your computer. Your husband has been recording your every move for months." Victoria felt sick, and not just from the labor pains. "How long?" "Based on the data logs, at least 8 months, possibly longer." "Mrs. Blackwood, he has hours of footage of you in private moments. Conversations with friends, phone calls, personal activities. We also confirmed that your prenatal vitamins contained alprazolam, a sedative that would have kept you docile and compliant." Sarah was listening to the conversation while helping Victoria to the car. "How much?" she asked. "Low dose, but consistent daily administration over months," Rodriguez replied. "Mrs. Blackwood, this isn't just domestic violence anymore. We're looking at charges of unlawful surveillance, drugging without consent, and psychological torture. Your husband is facing potential federal charges." Another contraction, stronger than the previous ones, reminded Victoria that her body had its own timeline, regardless of legal revelations. "Detective, I have to go. The baby is coming." "One more thing," Rodriguez said urgently. "Your husband's lawyers are claiming that you've been having an affair with James Mitchell. They're saying the baby might not be his. They're going to demand a paternity test." Victoria stared at Sarah in shock. Even knowing Richard's capacity for cruelty, this felt like a new low. "The baby is Richard's. James and I never—" "I know," Rodriguez said. "But they're going to drag this out as long as possible, make it as ugly as they can. I wanted you to be prepared." As Sarah drove through the city streets toward the hospital, Victoria tried to process everything she'd learned. Richard hadn't just controlled her, he'd surveilled her like a prisoner. He'd drugged her into compliance, and now he was planning to question the paternity of their child to avoid taking responsibility for his abuse. "He's going to destroy me in court," Victoria said, another contraction making her grip the door handle. "No, he's not," Sarah said firmly, "because this isn't 3 years ago, and you're not the same woman who was too scared to fight back. You have evidence now. You have allies, and you have the truth." They arrived at the hospital just as Victoria's contractions intensified to the point where talking became difficult. As the nurses wheeled her to a delivery room, Victoria caught a glimpse of the waiting area and was surprised to see James sitting quietly in a corner, looking anxious. "What are you doing here?" she managed to ask as they passed him. "Sarah called me," he said, standing up. "I wanted to make sure you weren't alone." The simple kindness of his presence hit Victoria harder than all the legal revelations. This man, who owed her nothing after the way she left him, had shown up because she might need support. The contrast with Richard, who was currently giving investor presentations while his wife went into labor, was stark. But there was no time to process emotions. Victoria's labor was progressing rapidly, and Dr. Parker was concerned about the baby's heart rate. "We need to move quickly," the doctor announced. "Victoria, I need you to focus on breathing and pushing when I tell you. Can you do that?" Victoria nodded, but as another contraction peaked, she found herself thinking about Richard's claim that the baby might not be his. It was a lie designed to hurt her, but it also reminded her of something important. This baby, whatever else happened, deserved better than to grow up in a household defined by surveillance, control, and psychological manipulation. Even if Victoria had to start over with nothing, even if she had to rebuild her entire life from scratch, her daughter deserved a mother who was whole and honest and brave. "Push," Dr. Parker commanded, and Victoria pushed with all the strength she had left. An hour later, Isabella Rose Blackwood entered the world at 11:53 p.m., healthy and furious, and absolutely perfect. As the nurses cleaned her up, Victoria held her daughter and felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: complete, uncomplicated joy. "She's beautiful," James said softly from the doorway, where he'd been waiting for news. "She is," Victoria agreed, studying her daughter's tiny face. Isabella had Richard's dark hair, but Victoria's stubborn chin. She was going to be trouble in all the best ways. Sarah appeared with coffee and updates. "Richard's been arrested again. Apparently, when the police showed up at his investor presentation to execute additional warrants, he tried to destroy evidence. There's video of him throwing a laptop out a 10th floor window." Victoria almost laughed. "He threw a laptop out a window?" "In front of 300 investors in a room full of reporters," Sarah confirmed. "His company's stock is in freefall. Eleanor Blackwood is reportedly having what the society pages are calling a complete nervous breakdown." Isabella yawned and settled against Victoria's chest, completely unaware that she'd been born into chaos. Victoria looked down at her daughter and made a silent promise. This little girl would grow up knowing she was loved unconditionally, that she could trust the people who claimed to care about her, and that she never had to choose between security and authenticity. "What happens now?" Victoria asked. "Now," Sarah said, "you recover. You bond with your daughter. You let the legal system handle Richard and focus on figuring out what kind of life you want to build." Victoria looked at James, who was still standing quietly by the door, respecting her space but ready to help if needed. 3 years ago, she'd been too afraid to build a life with him. Now she was too wise to expect him to wait for her to figure out how to build a life with herself. But maybe, if she could learn to be whole again, there might be room in that life for second chances. Isabella chose that moment to open her eyes and look directly at her mother, as if to say, "What are you waiting for?" Victoria smiled. "I think we're going to be just fine." Victoria woke to chaos at 4 a.m. Alarms were ringing, nurses were rushing into her room, and Isabella's bassinet was empty. "Where's my baby?" Victoria struggled to sit up, her body protesting after the difficult delivery. "She's fine," Dr. Parker said quickly, but her expression was tense. "Isabella's breathing became irregular about an hour ago. We've moved her to the NICU as a precaution." Terror flooded Victoria's system, the kind of primal fear that makes everything else irrelevant. "What does that mean? Is she going to be okay?" "Premature babies sometimes have trouble regulating their breathing and body temperature," Dr. Parker explained as she helped Victoria into a wheelchair. "It's usually temporary, but we want to monitor her closely." As they wheeled toward the NICU, Victoria caught sight of a familiar figure arguing with hospital security near the elevator. Richard, looking haggard and desperate, was trying to push past two guards. "That's my daughter," he was shouting. "I have a right to see my daughter." One of the security guards noticed Victoria and approached her wheelchair. "Ma'am, this gentleman claims to be the baby's father, but his name isn't on our authorized visitor list." Victoria stared at her husband, a strange husband, she corrected herself, and saw a stranger. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled, and there was something wild in his eyes that she'd never seen before. "He is her father," Victoria said carefully. But I don't want him near me or the baby right now. Richard's face twisted with fury. Victoria, you can't keep me from my own child. Erum. I can when you're facing criminal charges for abusing her mother, Victoria replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. That's temporary insanity brought on by your betrayal, Richard snarled. I know you've been sleeping with that food truck cook. I have recordings. You have recordings of me because you illegally surveilled our home, Victoria interrupted. And if you actually listened to those recordings, you'd know I never cheated on you. Dr. Parker was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Perhaps we should continue this discussion later. No, Richard said, pulling out his phone. I want a paternity test. Right now. I'm not paying child support for another man's baby. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Victoria felt something inside her finally break completely, not with sadness or fear, but with rage so pure it was almost clarifying. You want to question paternity? She said, her voice deadly quiet. Fine. Order the test. But while we're waiting for results, let me tell you exactly what those recordings of yours prove. She started counting on her fingers. They prove that I spent 3 years isolated in our apartment, afraid to make decisions without your permission. They prove that you monitored my every conversation, controlled my every movement, and drugged me daily to keep me compliant. They prove that I never once betrayed our marriage vows, even when I probably should have. Richard's lawyer appeared then, William Hayes, looking exhausted and defeated. Richard, stop talking. Victoria, my client is prepared to discuss custody arrangements. Your client, Victoria said, never taking her eyes off Richard, is going to prison, and when Isabella is old enough to understand, I'm going to tell her exactly what kind of man her father really is. Richard lunged toward her then, and Victoria saw the same rage that had led to the slap in the food truck plaza. But this time James appeared out of nowhere, intercepting Richard's movement and putting himself firmly between the wheelchair and Victoria's soon-to-be ex-husband. That's enough, James said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. She just gave birth to your daughter, and your daughter is in the NICU fighting to breathe properly. Maybe focus on that instead of your wounded pride. This is all your fault, Richard spat at James. If I hadn't shown up, James replied, Victoria might never have realized that she deserved better than a man who thinks love means control. Hospital security finally intervened, escorting Richard and his lawyer away from the NICU. Victoria watched her husband disappear around a corner and felt nothing but relief. How long have you been here? She asked James as Dr. Parker resumed wheeling her toward Isabella's room. Sarah called me when Isabella's breathing became irregular, he said. I hope that's okay. I thought I might need a friend, Victoria finished. Yes, I do. The NICU was a maze of monitors and machines, but none of the technological chaos mattered when Victoria saw her daughter. Isabella lay in a clear incubator, tiny and perfect, with wires monitoring her vital signs and a small oxygen cannula helping her breathe. She's doing much better, the NICU nurse assured them. Premature lungs just need a little extra help sometimes. She'll probably be ready to go home in a few days. Victoria reached through the incubator's porthole and touched Isabella's impossibly small hand. Her daughter's fingers wrapped around Victoria's thumb with surprising strength. She's a fighter, James observed, his voice soft with wonder. She has to be, Victoria said. She's going to grow up with a father in prison and a mother who's starting over from scratch at 30. She's going to grow up with a mother who's brave enough to choose truth over comfort, James corrected. That's not nothing, Vicky. Victoria looked at him, really looked. 3 years had changed them both. James was more confident now, more settled in his own skin. Success hadn't made him arrogant, but it had made him solid in a way that reminded Victoria of why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Jamie, she said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. He nodded. Why are you here? Really? I destroyed our relationship, chose money over love, and haven't spoken to you in 3 years. Why do you care what happens to me? James was quiet for a long moment, watching Isabella sleep. Do you remember the night before you left me? Victoria's throat tightened. Yes. You were terrified about money, about ending up like your parents, drowning in medical debt with no way out. And instead of addressing those fears, I offered you platitudes about love conquering all. James, let me finish. I was 29 and naive and so focused on our romantic future that I couldn't see you needed practical solutions, not grand gestures. I failed you then, Vicky. I'm not going to fail you again. You don't owe me anything, Victoria said. I owe you the truth, James replied. I spent 3 years telling myself I was over you, but I wasn't. I was just waiting, building a life that would be worthy of you if you ever came back to it. Victoria felt tears starting, the kind that come from relief rather than sadness. I don't know how to start over. I don't even know who I am without someone else making my decisions. Then we'll figure it out together, James said simply. If you want to. Isabella chose that moment to open her eyes and look directly at her mother, as if she approved of the conversation happening around her incubator. Victoria smiled through her tears. I think she likes you. I like her too, James said. She's got her mother's stubborn streak. As the morning light began filtering through the NICU windows, Victoria realized she was no longer afraid. Not of starting over, not of raising Isabella alone, not of rebuilding her life from nothing. She had been given a gift, the chance to be the person she'd always meant to be, before fear had made all her choices for her. It was going to be the hardest thing she'd ever done. It was also going to be worth everything. 6 weeks after Isabella's birth, Victoria sat in a lawyer's office downtown, signing the papers that would officially end her marriage to Richard Blackwood. Her daughter slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the legal machinery grinding around her. The prenuptial agreement has been declared void due to your husband's criminal activities, attorney Lisa Chen explained. You're entitled to half of all marital assets, plus additional compensation for the psychological trauma and illegal surveillance. Victoria looked at the settlement figure and felt dizzy. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to ensure Isabella's future and her own independence. What about Richard, she asked. He pled guilty to multiple charges to avoid a trial, Chen replied. 5 years in federal prison for the surveillance and drugging charges, plus additional time for the attempted evidence destruction. He'll likely serve 7 years total. 7 years. Isabella would be in elementary school when her father was released. It should have made Victoria sad, but instead she felt only relief that her daughter would grow up without Richard's toxic influence during her most formative years. There's also this, Chen said, sliding another document across the table. Mr. Blackwood has agreed to relinquish all parental rights in exchange for reduced alimony obligations. Victoria stared at the papers. Richard was essentially disowning his daughter to avoid paying long-term support. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but also liberating. He doesn't want to be her father, Victoria said, more to herself than to the lawyer. Apparently not, which means you have complete custody and decision-making authority. Isabella will never have to visit him in prison, never have to navigate court-ordered visitation with a convicted abuser. After signing the final papers, Victoria walked out into the autumn afternoon, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her marriage was over, Richard was out of their lives permanently, and she had the resources to build whatever future she wanted. But first, she had a phone call to make. Marcus Webb, this is Victoria Sterling. I think it's time we had a conversation about that restaurant you and James have been planning. Cameron. An hour later, Victoria sat in the small office above James's expanded food truck operation, Isabella in her lap, listening to Marcus outline their business proposal. We want to open a community kitchen, Marcus explained, spreading blueprints across the desk. Half restaurant, half cooking school, with a sliding scale payment system so anyone can afford to eat there or take classes. Victoria studied the plans, her business mind automatically calculating costs and potential revenue streams. How are you funding it? James has been saving for 3 years, Marcus said. Plus, we're trying to do, but we need someone who understands food media, who can help us tell the story in a way that builds community support. Victoria looked at James, who had been unusually quiet during the presentation. What's your role in all this? Head chef, obviously, but also curriculum development for the cooking classes. I want to teach people that good food doesn't have to be expensive or complicated. James paused, then added carefully, we were hoping you might consider being our director of communications, if you're interested in working again. Victoria felt a familiar flutter of excitement, the same feeling she used to get when she discovered a new restaurant or interviewed a chef who was doing something genuinely innovative. She'd forgotten how much she missed that feeling. "I'd want to write about it too," she said. "Document the whole process from startup to opening. Maybe turn it into a book about food, community, and second chances." "That sounds perfect," Marcus said, grinning. Victoria looked down at Isabella, who was chewing thoughtfully on her own fist. "What do you think, baby girl? Should mommy go back to work?" Isabella gurgled what Victoria chose to interpret as enthusiastic approval. "There's one more thing," James said, and Victoria heard nervousness in his voice for the first time. "The location we want is the old Brennan's building on 5th Street. It's been empty for 2 years, but the owner is willing to sell." Victoria knew the building. She and James had looked at it 3 years ago when they'd been planning their own restaurant. It had been perfect then. Too perfect and too expensive for two people with no investors and big dreams. "How much?" she asked. Marcus named a figure that would have been impossible 3 years ago, but was well within reach of Victoria's divorce settlement. "Are you asking me to be a partner?" Victoria said slowly. "We're asking you to be family," James said simply. "Business partner, creative collaborator, friend, whatever feels right to you." Victoria stood up, still holding Isabella, and walked to the window overlooking the food truck plaza. The same plaza where Richard had slapped her 10 weeks ago, destroying her marriage and changing everything. Now it looked different. Not like a place where her life had fallen apart, but like the place where it had finally begun. "I'll need to set up childcare," she said, turning back to face them. "And I'll want editorial control over any marketing materials. And I reserve the right to write honestly about this experience, even if it makes us all look foolish sometimes." "Deal," James and Marcus said simultaneously. Victoria smiled, feeling like herself for the first time in 3 years. "Then let's build something beautiful." 3 months later, Victoria stood in the construction chaos of what would become the 5th Street kitchen, Isabella strapped to her chest in a carrier, directing the installation of the custom wood-fired oven James had designed. Her laptop was balanced on a sawdust-covered counter, open to the blog post she was writing about the renovation process. The blog had taken off beyond her wildest expectations. Her honest writing about leaving her abusive marriage, starting over as a single mother, and building a business with her ex-fiancé had resonated with thousands of readers. Food magazines were calling, book agents were interested, and somehow she'd accidentally become a voice for women rebuilding their lives after domestic violence. "The oven's beautiful," Sarah said, appearing with coffee and the kind of satisfied expression that meant she'd been meddling in Victoria's life again. "It should be, for what we paid for it," Victoria replied, but she was smiling. The oven was beautiful, and it was theirs, and it represented everything she thought was impossible 3 years ago. "So," Sarah said casually, "James asked me to give you this." She handed Victoria an envelope with her name written in James's familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a restaurant review, the first one Victoria had ever written about his cooking, published 3.5 years ago in City Food magazine. At the bottom, James had added a note. "You wrote that I cooked with love. I'm still learning how to do that. Maybe you could teach me again?" Victoria looked across the construction site to where James was consulting with the contractor about the kitchen layout. He felt her gaze and looked up, raising his eyebrows in a silent question. She'd spent 3 years learning that security without love was just a beautiful prison. But she'd also learned that she could be complete on her own, that she didn't need someone else to make her whole. The question now wasn't whether she needed James, but whether she wanted to build something with him. Not from fear this time, but from choice. Not because she was afraid to be alone, but because she was brave enough to risk being vulnerable again. Isabella chose that moment to wake up and reach toward James with tiny, grabbing hands. He walked over, and Victoria's daughter immediately tried to grab his glasses. "She likes you," Victoria observed. "I like her too," James said, gently extracting his glasses from Isabella's grip. "I like her mother as well." "Even though her mother made terrible decisions and broke your heart?" "Especially because her mother learned from those decisions and became someone worth waiting for." Victoria looked around the half-built restaurant, at the life she was constructing from scratch at 31, and realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of love, not of loss, not of the uncertainty that came with building something real instead of something safe. Ask me again in 6 months, and she said, when the restaurant is open and we know if we can actually work together without killing each other. James smiled, the same smile that had made her fall in love with him 4 years ago. I can wait 6 months. I've gotten good at waiting. And I've gotten good at making decisions for the right reasons, Victoria replied. Isabella babbled something that sounded suspiciously like approval, and Victoria laughed. Her daughter was going to grow up in a world where love was honest, where people chose each other freely, where second chances were possible if you were brave enough to take them. It was going to be beautiful. 1 year later, Victoria stood behind the counter of the Fifth Street kitchen, watching James teach a cooking class to a group of teenagers from the local community center. Isabella, now walking and babbling in sentences only Victoria could understand, was helping by banging wooden spoons against anything within reach. The key to a perfect risotto, James was explaining patiently, is not to rush it. Good food takes time. Victoria smiled, thinking about how that philosophy had come to define more than just their cooking. Everything worth having took time, healing from trauma, building trust, learning to choose love over fear. The restaurant had been open for 6 months and was already booked solid on weekends. More importantly, it was exactly what they'd envisioned. A place where excellent food met genuine community, where people came not just to eat but to connect. Victoria's book about the experience, Starting Over, a memoir of food, love, and second chances, was being published next month. The advance had been substantial enough to fund their expansion plans and establish a scholarship program for single mothers wanting to attend culinary school. Mommy! Isabella had discovered that she could get attention by shouting, and she used this power liberally. What, baby girl? Victoria scooped up her daughter, who immediately tried to grab the pen Victoria had been using to work on tomorrow's specials. Ames! Isabella pointed toward James with delight. James looked over from the cooking class and waved, making Isabella giggle and hide her face against Victoria's shoulder. Somewhere over the past year, he'd become a constant presence in Isabella's life, not trying to replace the father she'd never known, but being the kind of steady, loving adult every child deserved. The front door chimed and Detective Rodriguez entered with a woman Victoria didn't recognize. Victoria, I'd like you to meet Emily Chen. She's starting our new domestic violence support program, and she's hoping to discuss a partnership with the restaurant. Victoria settled Isabella in her high chair with some breadsticks and joined the conversation. Over the past year, she'd become something of an accidental advocate for domestic violence survivors, and she was always interested in ways to use the restaurant as a resource for women rebuilding their lives. We're looking for places where survivors can work while they're getting back on their feet, Emily explained. Flexible schedules, supportive environments, job training opportunities. We'd love to be part of that, Victoria said immediately. Actually, we're opening a second location next year, a coffee shop and bakery that would be perfect for that kind of program. As they discussed details, Victoria found herself thinking about the woman she'd been a year ago, terrified, isolated, convinced that she was trapped in a life she'd chosen and therefore deserved. She'd had no idea that admitting the truth about her marriage would lead to this, a thriving business, a meaningful relationship with James that was built on honesty instead of desperation, and a daughter who would grow up knowing she was loved unconditionally. After Emily and Detective Rodriguez left, Victoria found herself alone in the restaurant with James and Isabella. The lunch crowd had dispersed, the cooking class had ended, and the afternoon light was filtering through the windows in a way that made the whole space glow golden. Good day? James asked, starting the prep work for dinner service. Very good day, Victoria confirmed. Emily's program could help a lot of women. Speaking of helping women, James said, and Victoria heard something in his voice that made her look up from her inventory lists. He was standing by the wood-fired oven, the same oven where they'd had their first real conversation about building a future together. In his hand was a small velvet box. Victoria's heart stopped. James, let me say this before I lose my nerve, he said, crossing to where she stood behind the counter. A year ago, you told me to ask you again in 6 months, when we knew if we could work together without killing each other. That was 18 months ago, Victoria pointed out, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to be sure, James said with a smile. Sure that we were building something real instead of just trying to recapture what we used to have. sure that you were choosing me because you wanted to, not because you needed to. Isabella, as if sensing the importance of the moment, had gone completely quiet in her high chair, watching with wide eyes. Victoria Sterling, James continued, opening the box to reveal a simple, beautiful ring. You are the strongest, bravest, most honest woman I've ever known. You're an incredible mother, a brilliant writer, and the best business partner I could ask for. But more than any of that, you're my best friend, and I love you exactly as you are. He dropped to one knee and Victoria felt tears starting. Will you marry me? Not because you need security or because you're afraid to be alone, but because we make something beautiful together? Victoria looked at this man who had waited for her, who had helped her rebuild her life without trying to control it, who loved her daughter as if she were his own. Then she looked at Isabella, who was clapping her hands with delight as if she understood exactly what was happening. A year ago, the idea of marriage would have terrified Victoria. Now it just felt like the next step in a journey they'd already been taking together. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, absolutely yes. James slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, just like everything else about their rebuilt relationship, and kissed her as Isabella cheered from her high chair. Ames, Isabella shouted approvingly. Mommy. That's right, baby girl, Victoria said, picking up her daughter. That's your Ames, and he's going to be part of our family now. Isabella considered this for a moment, then reached out and grabbed James's nose, which was apparently her seal of approval. As the three of them stood together in the restaurant they'd built, surrounded by the life they'd chosen instead of the one fear had tried to force on them, Victoria thought about the woman she'd been that day in the food truck plaza, scared, controlled, slowly disappearing under the weight of a marriage that was killing her spirit. That woman would never have believed she could be this happy, this free, this authentically herself. What are you thinking about? James asked, following her gaze around their restaurant. Just all of it. The choices that led us here. The fact that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the door to the life you were always meant to live. James nodded, understanding as always. No regrets? Victoria looked at her daughter, at her fiancé, at the business they'd built together and the future stretching ahead of them, full of possibility. No regrets, she said firmly. Just gratitude. Isabella babbled something that sounded like agreement, and they all laughed. Outside, the food truck plaza was busy with the late afternoon crowd, people choosing their meals and their conversations and their small daily happenings. Victoria remembered standing in that same plaza a year ago, her marriage ending in the most public way possible, terrified of what came next. Now she knew. What came next was everything. All the beautiful, complicated, honest, difficult, joyful work of building a real life with real love and real choices. It was going to be worth everything they'd been through to get here. Isabella reached out and touched Victoria's face with a sticky finger, bringing her attention back to the present moment. What is it, baby girl? Home, Isabella said clearly, her first completely understandable word. Victoria looked around at their restaurant, at James, at the life they were building together, and smiled. Yes, sweetheart, we're home. 5 years later, Victoria Sterling Mitchell stood at the podium of the National Domestic Violence Awareness Conference, looking out at an audience of survivors, advocates, and counselors. Isabella, now 6 and starting first grade, sat in the front row next to James, swinging her legs and coloring in a notebook. My name is Victoria Sterling Mitchell, she began, and 5 years ago my husband slapped me in front of 50 strangers in a food truck plaza because I dared to speak to my ex-fiancé. The audience was quiet, attentive. Victoria had told this story hundreds of times now, in her book, in interviews, in speeches like this one, but it never got easier, and it never stopped being necessary. I thought I was trapped. I thought I had to choose between safety and love, between financial security and emotional freedom. I thought leaving would mean losing everything. She looked at Isabella, who had looked up from her coloring to listen to her mother speak. What I learned is that staying in an abusive relationship means you've already lost everything that matters. Your sense of self, your ability to trust your own judgment, your capacity for joy. You lose yourself so gradually that you don't even notice until someone offers you a mirror. Victoria's voice grew stronger as she continued. That mirror, for me, was my ex-fiancé stepping between me and my abuser without hesitation. It was a detective who recognized the signs of systematic abuse. It was a friend who refused to let me make excuses for someone else's violence. It was my daughter, who deserved a mother who was whole. The speech went on for 20 more minutes, covering the practical aspects of leaving an abusive marriage, the resources available to survivors, and the long journey of rebuilding self-trust. But Victoria's mind kept drifting to the life she'd built since that day in the plaza. The Fifth Street Kitchen had become a model for community-centered dining, featured in food magazines and documentary films. Their second location, the coffee shop with the Domestic Violence Survivor Employment Program, was thriving. Victoria's second book about the intersection of food and healing would be published next month. But more than professional success, Victoria had found something she'd never expected: peace. Not the brittle, fearful peace of her marriage to Richard, but the deep, settled peace that comes from living authentically. Richard had been released from prison the previous year and had immediately violated his restraining order by attempting to contact Isabella. He was back in prison now, facing additional charges, and Victoria felt nothing but pity for a man so broken that he couldn't let go of people who were better off without him. Eleanor Blackwood had died 6 months after Richard's conviction, reportedly of a heart attack brought on by the stress of her son's disgrace. Victoria had attended the funeral, not out of obligation but out of closure. She'd looked at the woman who had threatened and intimidated her and felt only sadness for someone who had lived so small a life, despite having every privilege. After the speech, Victoria was approached by a young woman who looked familiar. The same hollow eyes, the same careful way of moving that Victoria remembered from her own reflection 5 years ago. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Sarah Martinez. I read your book, and I think I need help." Victoria sat with Sarah for an hour, listening to a story that was heartbreakingly familiar. The gradual isolation, the financial control, the way abuse always escalated. Victoria gave her Detective Rodriguez's card, the number for the local shelter, and her own personal cell phone number. "It's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done," Victoria told her honestly, "but it's also going to save your life." Later, driving home with James and Isabella, Victoria felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and purpose that came from this kind of work. "Good speech, Mommy," Isabella said from her car seat. "I like the part about mirrors." "What did you think about mirrors?" Victoria asked. "That sometimes you need other people to help you see who you really are," Isabella replied with 6-year-old wisdom. James reached over and squeezed Victoria's hand. "Still glad you chose the hard path?" Victoria looked at her wedding ring, not the massive diamond Richard had bought to display his ownership, but the simple band James had chosen to represent their partnership. She thought about Sarah Martinez, about all the women still trapped in beautiful prisons, about the life she might have lived if she'd been too afraid to leave. "Every day," she said. That night, after Isabella was asleep and James was working on menu planning for next week's cooking classes, Victoria sat in her home office and opened her laptop. She'd been working on a new piece about the relationship between food and memory, between cooking and healing. But instead of writing about food, she found herself typing a letter. To the woman reading this who thinks she's trapped, to the woman who chose security over love and is paying for it every day, to the woman who thinks leaving would cost her everything. You're not trapped, you're not powerless, and you're not alone. 5 years ago, I thought I had to choose between love and security. I thought leaving my abusive marriage would mean losing everything I'd worked for. I was wrong. What I lost was fear. What I gained was freedom. The life you're living isn't the only option. The person you've become isn't who you have to stay. And the love you deserve, real love, honest love, love that doesn't come with conditions or control, is possible. But first you have to choose yourself. It's the hardest choice you'll ever make. It's also the only one that matters. With love and hope, Victoria. She posted the letter on her blog and closed the laptop. Tomorrow there would be responses, hundreds of them, from women at every stage of the journey, from captivity to freedom. Victoria would answer as many as she could, offering resources and hope and the hard-won wisdom that came from having walked this path herself. But tonight, she was going to sit with her husband in the kitchen they'd designed together, drinking tea and talking about their daughter's first week of school and the new recipes they were testing for the fall menu. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, built one honest choice at a time. Victoria looked around at her home, really hers, chosen and decorated and filled with people who loved her unconditionally, and smiled. She had finally learned the difference between being safe and being free. And free, she had discovered, was everything. If this story resonates with you, whether you've faced your own crossroads between security and authenticity, or you know someone who has, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like Victoria's remind us that it's never too late to choose courage over comfort. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves love without conditions. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not trapped. And subscribe for more stories about the messy, beautiful process of reclaiming your life. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply witness someone else's journey to freedom. And remember that our own is always possible.